Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're back on the WPL C44KM. We're going to add the suspension links to the front axle and then assemble the rear. Right now we have the bits for the rear axle laid out, so we can pop them off to the side for a couple of minutes while we deal with the linkages. There's a set of long and short rods along with another bent one that's the same as the one we use for the steering on the front. Looking at the instructions, we need to make 4 82mm ones, 3 60mm ones, and a single 56mm one. The measurement is from the outside edges of the rod ends. So if we set the vernier to 82mm, all we need to do is make the linkage a snug fit between the arms. We can use some pliers to grab a rod, thread on a rod end on each end, and using a screwdriver for leverage, do them up until we hit just the right length. Just remember that with the extra leverage, it's fairly easy to spin them on fast enough that you're going to generate a bit of heat, so don't go too silly or you might just melt the plastic. Rinse and repeat, and you'll end up with 4 long ones, 3 short ones, and 1 very short one. The bent rod we don't need as far as I can see, so that can go back in its pot just in case. To fit the links to the front axle, we need one of the long M3 screws with a nylock nut, a brass ball end with built-in thread, a brass ball with spacery bits on either side, and 2 brass ball ends with double balls. The single threaded ball end screws down into the platform at the front of the axle that ends up being used for the panhard bar. The very short linkage then just pops over the ball. Next we can pop one of the long linkages over the inner ball on a double ball end and thread that onto the outside of one of the lower mounts. And not too surprisingly, we need to do the same with another long linkage and double ball on the other side. This time though, while I was doing the screw up, the plastic snapped. Now I could feel it was a bit stiff, but nothing too outrageous. Turns out there was an air bubble right at the weakest point. Now I didn't record the fix, as it's a complete bodge and isn't going to last 5 minutes. I just drilled a hole and glued in a metal pin. Hopefully it'll last long enough to build up the truck, but it's in such a high stress position it's going to give way with the slightest of bumps. Now I've ordered a pair of metal mounts, so when they arrive we're going to swap them out. For the top link we need to clip the ball with the spacery bits into a short linkage and offer it up to the top mounts on the mount on the axle. Then pass an M3 screw through and install the nylock nut on the end. Now it's important that we don't do the nut up too tight. In fact, we only want to take up the slack. The screw should be able to turn without much force. There's no benefit at all in it being any tighter. Now that's out of the way, we can start on the rear axle, which means we're on the other side of the instruction sheet. There's only 6 more panels to go. We're going to need the rear axle parts back again, and just like the front axle, we need to remove the 4 long screws that attach the input gear mount so we can remove it. This time though, we still can't separate the axle halves as there's big flanges on the ends that are still holding them together. They're just a press fit, so they come off with some light force. We start by loosely fitting a grub screw in the large brass gear, loose enough that we can still pass the gear over the axle shaft and line up the grub screw with the flat spot near the middle. Then we just need to do up the grub just a little bit so the gear can't fall off the shaft, but so we can still slide it up and down on the flat. Next we can feed a pair of bearings onto each end of the axle shaft. The centre 2 go right up against the brass gear and the outer 2 go out near the ends. When we put the assembly into one of the axle halves, the bearings sit nicely in pockets. And once it's in, if we give it a spin, it's nice and free, so we know the shaft is perfectly straight. On the ends of the axle shafts, we need to fit the stubs that convert the round axle to the hex for the wheels. Just like the gear, we need to loosely install the grub screw in each one and pop them over the end of the axle. Then, with these, we can nip up the grub so they're grabbing the shaft. We'll still need to remove them again a bit later to add some thread lock, so there's no need to go silly. For the input gear, we need to press a bearing into the outside of the mount. Then for the other bearing, we pop it over the input shaft and push it into the mount, making sure the bearings are nicely seated, especially the inside one. Now we can do a test fit and see if we need to modify the axle housing just like the front one. With the two halves of the axle housing together, we can fit the input mount to the front of the axle. It's got 4 pins, so it'll locate, and as long as we grip it fairly tightly, we'll get a fairly good idea how the mesh is going to be. And just like the front one, it's extremely tight. It's not impossible to turn, but I can feel and hear it clicking past the high spots, which isn't good. The problem is the main gear can't move far enough away from the pinion because it's rubbing on the axle housing. If you've got some small files, it's really not a big deal to fix. All we need to do is carefully file the axle housing where it rubs on the gear. It's only a fraction of a millimetre, so don't overdo it. The best bet is to file them down just a little bit and do another test fit until you've got some backlash between the gears. What we want to end up seeing is the axle be able to spin nice and freely. It's still going to be a bit rattly and maybe a little bit grabby because there's no grease, but it should spin quite nicely. Now we know it's all going to work, we can pop out the grub screws and apply some thread lock. We just need the tiniest of spots on the threads. The grub screws are really small, so you don't need much. With the 3 grubs reinstalled, we can reassemble the axle halves and offer up the input gear mount. Now before we fit the diff cover, we need to add some grease. I'm going to use some Castrol General Purpose as it's fairly light and won't drag on the drivetrain too much. We don't need to use a lot as of course the gears aren't very big. Just a couple of smears will do the job. Now we can pop the diff cover on and install the 4 long screws. Now because of the paint on the diff cover, it's fairly tight. So when we do up the 4 screws, we need to do them up a little bit at a time, going one corner to the next so we don't stress anything. Right, that's the axle together and tight, so before we move on, it's a good idea to make sure the axle still spins smoothly. The 4 screws pull everything together, so if it's going to start to bind up again, it would be now. Next up, we're going to fit the plastic link mount, this time being extra careful not to break it. To mount the mount to the axle, we need to use the last 4 long M2.5 screws. The holes in the plastic mount are just slightly tight, so we need to use a screwdriver to thread them in. We want them threaded in just far enough that there's just a turn or so of thread poking out the bottom of the axle. Then we use these metal parts with the threaded holes to clamp it all together. We'll need to take these out again when we swap the mount for a metal one, so we won't bother using thread lock on the screws. The last bit of the axle assembly would be the flanges, but they are going to restrict access to the double ball ends, so we're going to fit the linkages first. The linkages are more or less the same as the front. We've got the 2 long linkages at the bottom on the double balls, and this time we pop a short link in each of the top slots with the long M3 screw and nylock to hold it all together. Again, we don't need to do them up super tight, we just need to take up the slack and it'll be just fine. On the ends of the axle we can slide the flanges back on. Now you'll need to squeeze up the axle ends just a bit so they'll go on, but with a bit of fiddling around they're good to go. And that's about it for this week. There's still lots of bits to do to get a rolling chassis though. We've got the drive shafts to put together, which should be interesting to film. There's the wheels and tyres to do, and then the body goes on. That'll be next time though, and after that of course there's all the electronics to work out. So we found a few more slightly questionable bits, but remembering it's still just a 50 quid kit, I'm quite happy. It would be nice if it was a perfect build, but it's still interesting to put together. It'll make you think a bit more than the average Tamiya. So that's it then. Thanks for watching. Like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a message if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!